If you want to turn the channel, go ahead, fool, turn the channel. If you want to learn something about God, shut your mouth and listen to me for a minute.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and welcome back to my What Killed the Genre series. This series is where I look at genres that have fallen off in terms of popularity, and I try to figure out what in the hell happened. And speaking of hell, today we're here to talk about Christian metal and hardcore. Because about 10 years ago, when the whole metalcore thing was starting to get really big, if anything, it seemed like it was more common than not to be a Christian in heavy music at that time. I mean, Underoath, As I Lay Dying, The Devil Wears Prada, it seemed like all the big new bands were Christian. And as somebody who grew up when it was just totally not okay at all to be a Christian in the metal or hardcore punk scene, this was very strange to me. But while the bands that I just mentioned I think are all still doing really well for themselves, I think it's fair to say that Christian metal or metalcore, whatever bands, or more accurately Christians in that scene, are a lot less prevalent than they were just a few years ago. So what happened? How did Christianity in metal go from being completely unacceptable to almost the default to what it is now, which is kind of somewhere in between? I'm not sure that I have all the answers, but I am going to do my best to find them in this video. Although this video is somewhat critical of certain aspects of Christian bands, it should not be interpreted at all as an attack on Christianity, nor should it be interpreted as an endorsement of Christianity. It's neither one, because that's not what this channel is about. And as always, I've made a Spotify playlist that's a companion for this video, so there is a link in the description. And also, I've been posting a lot more on Instagram recently, so if you want to give me a follow over there, it's at Finn McKenty. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. Part 1, when Christians were not welcome. This is roughly 1980 to 1995. As always in my videos, I think that in order to understand where we are today, it's best to understand how we got here. So let me rewind to the beginning of the story. Back when I got into punk and hardcore and metal in the early 90s, religion in general, but especially Christianity, was constantly mocked and criticized. And to say that Christians were unwelcome in the scene would be a massive understatement. I'll play you a couple songs here that'll give you an idea of how people thought about Christianity at the time. The Dead Kennedys' Religious Vomit. Suicidal Tendencies' Send Me Your Money.
Here comes another con hiding behind a collar. His only God is the almighty dollar.
And MDC, Millions of Damn Christians.
First a dozen, then there were thousands, but now there's millions of arrogant Christians.
And honestly, I kind of get why they felt that way, because in the 80s, there was a lot of really fucked up stuff happening with Christianity that, to be honest, gave people good reason to have a low opinion of it. First of all, there was this whole trend of like TV evangelists who all ended up getting exposed as liars and scammers and just scumbag pieces of shit.
We propelled, birds propel, eagles don't propel. We said, oh God, 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 oh God.
My personal favorite was a guy named Oral Roberts, who said that if his followers didn't give him $8 million by the end of the year, that God would kill him. Spoiler warning, he didn't get the money and somehow didn't die. I guess maybe God let him pay on an installment plan or something, who knows?
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
And in addition to the shitbag, phony TV evangelist, there was also a Christian right organization that was getting a lot of attention called The Moral Majority, and they were basically just as self-righteous and pompous as you would guess from the name. I mean, basically, the bottom line is that these were the people representing Christianity in the public eye, and they were complete pieces of shit. And that is why punk bands were, in my opinion, rightly so critical of Christianity at the time. Part 2, The Rise of Christianity. This is roughly 1995 to 2005. So with all that in mind, I was basically no different than any other kid who grew up listening to the Dead Kennedys, MDC, and Suicidal Tendencies. I pretty much thought Christianity was bullshit, and the idea of a Christian hardcore band was laughable to me. The only Christian band I knew of was Stryper, who, well, it's pretty hard to take them seriously. But that started to change when I discovered the world of what they called at the time spirit-filled hardcore, basically Christian hardcore bands. My introduction to that world was in, I think, 94 or 95 when I met a guy at a hardcore show in Seattle. It was probably Undertow, but I don't know, I can't remember. The guy was named Darren Vickers, and I had a zine back then where I did interviews, I reviewed records, and he told me he worked for a label called Tooth and Nail Records and offered to send me some of their stuff for review. I guess he liked me or thought for whatever reason that I would be receptive to it because he sent me this huge box of stuff. All the latest releases from Focused, Overcome, Strongarm, Focal Point, and Unashamed, and some other bands, some shirts, some stickers. It was like Christmas Day for me. I just dove right into it. And just to give you an idea of what I was listening to as I went through this box and as I explored this world, I'll just play you a couple of clips of some of my favorite songs from this era of Christian metal and hardcore. And there's tons more. I can't possibly list every band here, so please do not blow up the comments with like, oh, why didn't you mention this band or that band? This is not supposed to be a list of every Christian hardcore band ever. But here's a few of my favorites. Focal Point. Living Sacrifice. Believer. Embodiment. Zao. And Extol. This was all just brand new territory to me. I had no idea that this whole world of Christian hardcore existed because back then, the Christian and secular scenes really didn't intersect at all. They were like parallel universes. Even though I had a pretty negative opinion of Christianity, I listened and I read the lyrics with an open mind because to me, that's the punk thing to do, right? If we're operating from the first principle of question authority, well, then shouldn't I also question the punk authorities who said that all Christians were frauds and brainwashed idiots? So I listened with an open mind, and to my surprise, the more I listened, the more I liked it. And there were a couple reasons for that. First, like I said, these bands were just really fucking good on a purely musical basis. Like, you just heard those clips. These bands were savage. Even if I hated the lyrics, I would have listened just because the music was so good. Second, and more importantly, because even though I wasn't religious, so much of what they're saying in their lyrics really resonated with me. I was straight edge at the time. I was very into all the youth crew, like positive hardcore bands like Youth of Today and Gorilla Biscuits, and the things that these spirit-filled hardcore bands talked about were really along the same lines as what those bands talked about. Basically, it was just about being a better person. For example, there's a song by Unashamed called This Dividing Wall, which to this day I still think about when I catch myself getting angry about something that I shouldn't.
Do I get so upset? Let me feel it,
to me, the whole thing felt very punk. Like, being a vocally and unapologetically Christian hardcore band at that time was about the most controversial thing you could possibly do, and I really respected that they were willing to stick their necks out like that. And one thing I always found kind of funny is that so many people in the punk and hardcore scene criticized these bands for being quote-unquote preachy, which, yeah, to some extent they were, but aren't all punk bands? To me, there was no difference between Focal Point screaming about their belief in God and Earth Crisis screaming about their belief in veganism. These bands really made me think. They challenged me. And along with bands like Shelter and Downset, they made me realize that actually I'd been kind of dogmatic and closed-minded about religion. I just wrote all religion off as bullshit because that's what everybody else had said, and I had never really questioned it before. And that didn't feel good, so I decided I should at least give it a chance. I went to church a few times, I went to some Bible study classes with a friend of mine, and I actually really enjoyed going to those Bible study classes, and I learned a lot from them, but ultimately decided it wasn't for me. But still, I'm glad I was exposed to those bands. I'm glad that they opened my mind and made me realize how narrow-minded I had been. I'm still an atheist, but the truth is that I've learned a lot from Christians and Christianity in general that's made me a better, happier person. But in any case, I wasn't the only one who was getting into Christian metal, punk, and hardcore bands. This is when it hit an inflection point. This is when Christian bands started to practically take over the whole heavy music scene. Part 3, the explosion from roughly 2005 to 2012. Like I said before, up until now, the Christian and secular scenes were pretty much parallel universes that were aware of each other's existence but really never overlapped. And this is when that started to change. In hindsight, it actually probably started a few years earlier with the mainstream success of Christian bands like POD, Evanescence, and MXPX that made it not only socially acceptable to be a Christian in a band, but also put a lot of money into the pockets of labels like Tooth and Nail, which helped them fund the next generation of bands. Because although Tooth and Nail were by no means the only Christian label, I do think that they were the ones who were primarily responsible for the rise of Christian music during that era. They've always had a really good marketing machine with solid music videos, even back in the 90s when bands rarely had videos at all. They've always had great artwork, they've always had really legit advertising campaigns. Tooth and Nail were just on their game back then, again, and I think it worked. Because right around the mid-2000s, it seemed like every new band that was getting hype in basically like the Warped Tour scene, bands like Underoath, Norma Jean, and As I Lie Dying, among many others, was a Christian band. And unlike the bigger Christian bands of the past, like DC Talk or whatever, they didn't suck. They were actually really fucking good bands, regardless of whether they were Christian or not. And that alone was weird enough for me, but what was even more surprising to me is that nobody was upset about it. It was clear to me that something had changed, that Christianity was no longer unwelcome in the scene like it was when I was a kid. And I think a big part of that is because they didn't grow up in the 80s like I did, so they didn't have that same negative impression of Christianity based on all those like phony liar TV preachers and all that other stuff. And it wasn't just the Warped Tour scene. The Christian hardcore scene was on fire back then. Facedown Records, of course, were the ones driving that, just like Tooth and Nail were in the bigger rock scene, and I actually really love this scene and a lot of these bands, so I want to shout out a few of my favorites before I keep going. Deathstar.
Because the flesh is weak, one life from free, slipping away, a compromise and fall.
Sleeping Giant.
I've got a message for the world, it's not just us. You gotta pray.
And Seventh Star. And of course, other bands like Disciple, Impending Doom, Those Who Fear, Gideon, tons and tons of great bands from this scene, and a lot of really cool people. I also want to mention the whole Christian pop punk kind of scene, which I'm not going to talk about in this video in depth because this video is already long enough and that's a whole other topic, but I do just want to specifically mention some of the great bands from that scene, like, of course, MXPX, FM Static, Hawk Nelson, Reliant K, tons of great bands in that scene that I wish I could talk about in this video, but I just can't. By the late 2000s, it was a full-on phenomenon. The whole like Christian breakdown band thing was just everywhere. A few of the most prominent examples that you guys I'm sure are familiar with would be the Devil Wears Prada, For Today, August Burns Red, Memphis May Fire, Blessthefall, and tons more. And this stuff was big, like shockingly big. As a few examples, the Devil Wears Prada went to number 10 on Billboard, Memphis May Fire went to number 4, Blessthefall and For Today both went to number 15, and of course we have to talk about the top dogs of this whole scene, Underoath. They've been nominated for 3 Grammys, they've got 2 gold records, they've got 2 albums in the Billboard Top 10, as well as just a massively influential impact on a whole generation of emo, post-hardcore, and metalcore bands, Christian or not Christian. This was not underground stuff anymore. These bands were putting up real numbers any way you look at it. Anyway, there were so many Christian bands in the late 2000s that it was to the point where I just basically assumed that by default every new scene band with swoopy hair and breakdowns was a Christian band, which was just absolutely mind-blowing to me because, like I said, it was the exact polar opposite of how things were when I was getting into the stuff a decade or so earlier. The idea of that many bands being Christian was just really hard for me to wrap my head around. And like I said, I was not at all anti-Christian. If anything, I would say that I'm a Christian ally, so I wasn't like upset about the presence of Christians or anything like that, but still, there was just something that seemed off to me about all of it. Which brings me to the last era, Part 4, The Fall, from roughly 2012 to now. Because it turns out I was right, there was something off with all of it. If you fast forward to now, although Christian bands are still a bigger part of the heavy music scene than they were when I was a kid, it's definitely not like it was a few years ago during the peak of the Christian breakdown bands era, and I think there's a few reasons for that. First of all, a good chunk of those bands stopped being Christian, or at least Christian in the way that they used to be. The Devil Wears Prada or Underoath are both good examples of that. And of course, this is a super personal thing. Everyone has their own reason for it. But I think for a lot of them, what it comes down to is that they were raised in the church and they really never questioned it as kids. And remember, a lot of these scene bands started really, really young, like 15, 16 years old. And then when they got a little bit older, they started to think for themselves and realized that maybe they didn't really believe it, or at least that they didn't want to label themselves as Christians in the same way as they did when they were 15 or 16 years old. And I think a lot of the fans went through that same kind of evolution. And to me, just to be clear, that's not a bad thing at all. I think that we should all challenge our own assumptions. We should all question our beliefs, and sometimes that means changing your mind about something that you once believed in. I think that's actually a very healthy thing, so this is not a criticism of those people at all. As one example of this that I think is particularly eloquent, this is from a band called The Order of Elijah, whose singer, quote-unquote, came out as an atheist. He wrote a whole long statement, which I'll link in the description. I think it's worth reading, but here's one piece of it that I think is really well said. After one of the most difficult decisions in my adult years, I had no choice but to accept that I had shed my faith like a cocoon. It was scary yet liberating. It was confusing yet simple. I felt at peace yet completely shaken. I pretty much had to reprogram my way of thinking about the world. Not only that, I felt I had lived a lie for half my life. I read books, I tried meditating, hell, sometimes I'd even try to talk to God. So to me, that's cool. I love that he shared this about himself because I think it probably helped a lot of fans who are going through the same thing. But what's not so cool is the bands who lied about it. The ones who no longer believed it but still called themselves Christian bands because they knew they'd make more money that way. And I'm not going to name names here because there's no need to go there, but there are a lot of these guys who presented themselves as pious Christians to the fans, but behind the scenes they were degenerate scumbags on the tour bus. Just like the TV evangelists of the 80s. And you can only live a lie for so long, so eventually I think those bands either got discovered, they broke up, or the fans could just smell bullshit and eventually walked away. And then there were the bands who got really carried away with getting super preachy and judgmental, and worst of all, in my opinion, getting a savior complex. I would say For Today and Memphis May Fire would be the obvious examples here. Like when Matty Mullins said that he wanted to be the quote-unquote voice of a generation, to me that was just the last straw, just yuck. That's the kind of gross, egocentric stuff that reminded me of those 80s TV preachers who clearly cared more about fame and power and money and attention than they did about Christianity. And probably the biggest thing of all, Tim from As I Lay Dying trying to have his wife killed. That is just not a good look for Christian bands, to say the least. If you'll excuse the pun, I don't think there was any sudden public mass exodus from the Christian bands, but to me that was the end of the boom era of the Christian metalcore bands. And all in all, I'm glad that the phonies and the liars and the bigoted preachy bands fell off because honestly, we don't need them. But in a way, it also kind of bums me out that it went down the way it did because I know how much of a difference some of those sincere Christian bands made in my life when I was a kid. They had something to say and I listened and it made me a better person. And I want everybody to have that same experience. And like I said, there's certainly Christian bands who are still around, Underoath maybe being the most notable example, but I think the ones who stuck around have taken the approach of rather than being a Christian band per se, they're a band with members who are Christians, which ultimately I think is a lot healthier and more sustainable. Because although they're not beating people over the head with their beliefs like the bands of the last generation did, I think that's exactly why the current crop of Christian bands will have a truly lasting impact on their fans' lives. And the phonies, liars, and preachers will continue to fade into irrelevance. Okay, so there you go. Those are my thoughts on what happened to Christian metal, hardcore, metalcore, whatever. I would really love to hear what you guys think about this one, especially people who, unlike me, were in the church and can comment on it from that side of the equation. And hopefully this goes without saying, but please keep the comments respectful. I know this is potentially a touchy subject, but I also think it's pretty interesting, and I bet that we can have a really cool conversation if we're all just nice to each other. And lastly, reminder that I did make a playlist for this video with some of my favorite Christian metal, hardcore, punk songs on it. So if you are interested in that, check it out. There's a link in the description. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.